For that. Yeah, welcome everyone. So as you know, this masterclass is going to be really grasping at the root of, why we are all here, thinking about the future of law. We at the Future Law Institute, we are looking at how science is changing the way, developments in science is changing the way we are looking at ourselves and understanding ourselves, and therefore the laws and legal systems that we've created on old understandings, how can we transform those from wherever we're at in our niche areas and all of that. And so we were introduced to the lead facilitator, Alex May, by one of the experts in our network, Jeremy Lent. He said, the work that you all are doing is so aligned to this young guy who has been writing on this new concept of interconnected law. It is a concept that he has coined. And when I went to the writings of, and Anya and I went to the writings of Alex May and looked at it, we thought, oh my God, did we write this? And we met with him, and, I'm blown away by how profound he thinks about these issues, about the future of law. I think he is very humble, and he's a beautiful soul to share this with us. His thinking about it, but also very open to what everyone else in the room has to say, so that we're really excited to have this masterclass today, which we see as being very interactive and first really getting to the meat of why we are coming together in this little community of the Future Law Collaborative, getting to the meat of it. And so, yeah, I would like to, where is Alex? Why is he not on my screen, Anya? Is he here?
He's definitely here. Hey.
I haven't spoken, so I probably dropped out.
Right. So, yeah, without further ado,
no wonder.
Without further ado, I want you all to, I hope everyone has read up a little bit about Alex. It's on our website, but Alex is, I call him a young philosopher. It's my way of referring to him. He is an Oxford graduate and a London School of Economics graduate, and now looking to develop his thinking on interconnected law at the doctorate level. And so this is a pretty exciting space, I think, for us to open up for all of us to interact in. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Alex, and shall I start sharing screen? Yeah, you're on mute. We have to say that in every Zoom meeting.
I thought I pressed the button, but I missed it. No, thank you. Yeah, presentation is ready to go now.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Alex.
Great. And there is my PowerPoint. Thank you, Margaret. So yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. And it's great to be here with you all. I'll start by introducing myself, and then I'll ask about who else is in the room, and then I'll go through the agenda and cover a couple of other things before jumping into the topic. So yeah, about me, I currently live in London. I'm from the Midlands, moved to London 4 or 5 years ago. And I've been interested in politics, justice, society, and changing the world, and also law a bit since I was a teenager. And I did my undergrad at Oxford and then a master's at LSE, which I finished in 2017. And since then, I've done a few different jobs, including working as a legal research assistant for a couple of professors, a research project with Oxfam GB, and then I worked as a parliamentary assistant to an MP, a Labour MP in the UK Parliament for 2 years, which I finished in autumn. And my website is alexmay.co.uk, so you can find out more about me there. My email address is alex@alexmay.co.uk. And I can thank my dad for buying me that domain when I was a child and didn't understand what it was. So yeah, during my undergrad, my legal thinking revolved around what law's role in society is, what law is, how society should be politically and how law fits into that. And I studied legal theory, human rights, environmental law, and then also some international law and a digital technology module I can't remember the actual name of. And what I found looking at the threads in each area of what law's role is and how law needs to change things is once I started pulling at a few threads, it felt like the whole legal system started to unravel. And I came to the conclusion that the legal system as a whole needs to be different, needs to be transformed, which is now what I'm trying to do with interconnected law. Now, I just said I came to the conclusion, but of course it's not like this was purely independent thought. There's no such thing. The thinking about it came much more from all of the different things I've read. And as with every thinker, I'm standing on the shoulders of others, and I'll come on to more. What all those different materials are in a moment. So the next thing is it would be great to find out who I've got in the room. And what I'm going to do here is copy and paste into the chat. There it is. A small kind of get to know you questionnaire. Questionnaire is the wrong word. Just a few prompt questions. This is where usually in the room you'd go around and say a few things, but being as we're online, if you could respond saying the different things I put in the chat, which are your name and location, whether you have a foundation in law, and everyone is welcome. I'm not expecting people to be lawyers or have legal knowledge. Anything about your interest in this workshop, whether you want to take part in the small group discussion that will happen at about 4 o'clock, so 2 hours into the workshop, and whether there are any particular areas or issues that you're passionate about. And yeah, that's just very nice for me to get a feel of, feels a bit more like I'm connecting better with people and I know a bit about everyone instead of it just being names and pictures on the screen. Nice though that is. I will pause for a moment to give a bit of time for typing. In terms of engaging with the workshop, first thing is, of course, we're all going to be respectful and engage in good faith. So there'll be some discussion later, and yeah, we'll be very interested to hear. And my thinking is we're all here to learn from each other, even if I'm the one giving a 1 hour 45 presentation. And we are all here to learn from each other as well. There may be topics that come up later that are kind of beyond the scope of what we're going to discuss, or anything that's rude or intolerant. That's not to be tolerated. We have the paradox of intolerance, that we shouldn't tolerate intolerance. And that will help keep our discussion later on track. And in terms of the agenda of what I'll be covering, this should be on the next slide, or a couple of slides down. We've got the timings. Oh no, did it not work? Okay, well, agenda 1 got missed somewhere. The main thing to cover is, yeah, I must have accidentally, oh, that's the one. Okay, so it's ended up there. So I've begun my presentation. I'll be speaking until about 3:45, an hour and a half from now, depending on your time zone. And halfway through my talk, there'll be a 5-minute break. And then after my talk, there'll be a transitional lounge led by Margaret. Then there'll be small group discussions.
Led by Alyssa. Led by Alyssa.
Oh, led by Alyssa. Okay, great. Thank you. 4 o'clock, we'll come back together and I'll explain the small group discussions, which will then happen. And then about 20 minutes after that, we'll come back together for the final half hour of group discussion, questions, feedback, people sharing thoughts. And then the agenda of what I'm going to cover is, oh yeah, there's a slight lag on the presentation. So this is the introduction. I'll then talk about interconnected law in summary. So I give a 15-minute run through of everything. And then the rest of the workshop kind of follows it topic by topic, starting with the systems view and the idea of paradigm shift, then talking about what a relational approach to law is. Then it will talk about, then there'll probably be a break. Then it will talk about Earth Jurisprudence. Then I'll talk about social ecology. And then I'll finish with some final interconnected law, tying up the threads and parts. In terms of materials, I have got downloadable materials. The link is now in the chat. So the talk I'm giving, all of the content of that is downloadable as a document there. as is the PowerPoint. And all of the books I reference are also in a list there. And then the final thing on that page is a survey for the end of the workshop. Yeah, so obviously feel free to take notes, but you will have the words that I say available there as well. And that also means if my internet drops out, you at least have something to read without me. Margaret, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, just a quick question. I know we're going to have the questions and the breakout to the end. This is a lot you have here to cover. Can people ask questions in the chat during this part? Yeah.
That's an excellent question because I was meant to cover that a moment ago. So I'm glad you picked that up. Yes. The way I think of it is questions that are kind of in line with what I'm talking about, they can go into the chat. So if I've said something that didn't make sense, if I've dropped out for a moment, if someone wants me to expand on a certain point, then please, by all means, put those questions in the chat as I'm talking. And at the end of each section, I'll try and see if I can grab a couple of questions before moving on. And then some of those, if they end up being big questions, then they get saved for the big discussion at the end. So feel free to ask the questions, and that means they're also in the chat for later. Thank you, Margaret. Great. And then final thing before I start the summary. Yeah, I've been thinking through these ideas since my master's dissertation, and I'm fairly happy with what I've come up with and how it all fits together. It is mostly at a conceptual level, and this is a preemptive in case anyone starts asking me detailed legal questions. I'm not a lawyer and have not been closely engaged with law for a while. I also want to say that I'm talking from my perspective of being in the UK. So my experience is the UK and Anglo-American common law jurisdictions and Western European countries. And when I say phrases like our society, those are the ones I'm referring to. Because, yeah, I'm saying this to make sure that we don't homogenize any of the things I say as being a problem for all of humanity in the same way. So that's what I mean if I say our society and specifically the knowledge that I'm talking to. And yeah, this is also the first workshop I've given. So I'm very happy to be here with you. Thank you very much for joining me. And I look forward to the discussion. So, interconnected law in summary. This goes through the whole thing from the starting point, the conceptual foundations, through the ideas. So our background starting point is that we face lots of problems. There's a rising tide of crises, politically and socially. Social bonds are breaking down or had already broken down. Individual entitlement has outgrown ideas of personal and collective responsibility. Economic inequality is growing. It was never equal in the first place. Far-right politics is rising. And there's this feeling that gentle progress that has been made against racism, gender-based oppression, and other oppressions is now facing a lot more pushback, and the tides are turning. And we also face serious ecological crises. Climate change is one of them, mass extinction is another. And in general, we are living beyond what is sustainable. And all of these crises are interconnected. They are rooted in systems of domination, exploitation, and extraction, and they intersect and bolster one another. And law is an interwoven part of these various political, social, and economic systems. So many people have said, and I'm sure if you're at this workshop, you are already on board with the idea that we need transformative systemic change, politically, socially, ecologically, and so on. And part of this is our economic system, part of this is our cultural worldview, and part of this is also our legal system. But it seems to me that the need for changing our legal system has been relatively less recognized, both among lawyers and more broadly in our politics and societies, which is why I ended up taking on filling in part of that gap. And also to add at this point, when I use the words economy and society in my talk, also culture, law, politics, I consider these to all be interwoven, overlapping, inseparable systems. So they're not separate domains. It's not like we have the economy and society separately, it's all overlapping. And also, when we get onto kind of society, culture, and politics, the personal is also overlapping. I'll get onto that in more detail later, about how we are nested within that. So, founding conceptions, this is how we see the world, how we see humans, and how we see society. And the way I think we should understand humans is as individuals who are socio-ecologically embedded. So we are individual humans, but we're also very much part of all of our social relationships. We live in a dense web of relationships, from close social relationships, neighbors, acquaintances, colleagues, communities, our broader society. And we also have economic and employment relationships. We have political relations, and we have ecological relations with the rest of nature and the world around us. So the core idea of interconnected law is that we've misunderstood who we are. And once we recognize who we are in a better way, our law that is based on this should change to follow that. So law, the relational approach to law is to say that law is part of all of these relationships. Law influences, structures, and nudges all of the relationships that I've just talked about. And in the section on the relational approach, I'll go into detail about this. But the point to cover now is how law is part of all of these relations that make up our society. It's not the only thing, it's one of many things, but it is a key thing. So that front-loaded the description of how I think we should understand us. These are the kind of three conceptual paradigms that I'm rejecting by presenting this approach. The first is individualism. So the dominant paradigms in law and politics is an individualistic one, liberalism and neoliberalism. These are all about the individual, and the whole framing of the world focuses too much on the individual, and they see society as little more than an aggregation of individuals. And as I've just described, this is a mistake. No person is an island. And even if we try and think of the concept of self, there isn't an abstract individual self. We are made up of our experiences, our relationships, our interactions, our social influences. And we exist, we constitute ourselves, we think of ourselves, we live life in interactions with others. The second thing to reject is this idea that humans and nature are separate. So our dominant views see humans as separate from the rest of nature, whether it's in the ideas that humans are the only things with souls, or whether it's in ideas that humans are special because only humans have reason and thinking capability, whether it's economic systems that only value human economic activity and see the natural world as something to plunder and destroy or sell. Even the concept of having an environment is a human-centered way of seeing the world because it looks at the human environment. And instead of seeing this separation between humans and nature, we should we're also distinct. We should not kind of flatten ourselves to just being part of nature. We should see that we have a particular role in nature, in the Earth community. So it's not a dualistic separation, and it's not a kind of monolithic collapse either. And then the third thing to reject is the dualism that I just set out, because we currently see very much, and this is something I found in this talk, even preparing it, that we have this idea of separating into human relationships from human and the rest of nature relationships, our social and our ecological relationships. We kind of normally separate those, but actually they are all integrated. So I will talk of socio-ecological relationships as the integration of those two. So the next point to talk about is what follows from this thinking about who we are and what law is. And there are two versions of this argument. The first one is a formal argument to those not familiar with this language, this means it's about the form of something instead of the substance or the morality. A formal argument is meant to be morally neutral. And I've put this up as the next slide, which says the formal argument for interconnected law is that legal systems are generally based on a mistaken idea of humans and society, and therefore law would be a better tool if it was based on this better conception of humans and society and the natural world that I presented. So that argument means, regardless of my values and principles and how I've applied this idea, there is something in interconnected law that is value-free, that says law would be a better tool if it recognized the world it was in better, it would do a better job. There are philosophical questions about whether that neutrality is possible. I think it's mostly possible, and I won't go any more into the detail of that argument. But the second argument, and the one that I'm mostly going to be making, is this normative argument. And the normative argument, perfect, thank you, Margaret, is that once law recognizes its role in our society as part of the network of relationships we live in, law should work to make these relations ones which nurture and empower, instead of ones which harm, limit, and exploit. So the idea there is, if law is part of our relationships, it should do good. It should make the world better. And of course, the question that followed from that would be, what does it mean to make the world better? And I will talk a bit more about that in a moment. So in terms of the question of what that would look like, part of the reason I put this point up is because what I'm introducing here is a conceptual idea of interconnected law. I do not have a full transformative program of what a whole legal system would look like based on these concepts. I have some ideas, but most of what I'm doing is presenting this concept which points in certain directions and that people can then apply to particular areas, issues, domains, etc. The main idea of what I'm going for is, one, to get across the idea that our legal systems need to change, and two, present a conceptual framework for that change. And the 3 bullet points I put down, perfectly timed, we should transition to legal systems which work towards our network of relations being ones which nurture and empower, instead of ones which harm, limit, and exploit, which help us live harmoniously with the rest of nature, and which foster a more democratic distribution of power. So that's what I'm saying on that for now. The next thing to talk about is my values. Because I'm not talking about something that's morally neutral, I thought I should present what my values are. And I've dabbled in political theory and done political work for some years, but I'm going to keep it expectedly quite brief for this presentation. So my values are grounded in democracy, autonomy, equality, ecology, collectivity, and nature, earth democracy. So equality, currently power is far too concentrated, and my belief is that our relationships should be such that everyone involved has equal value and as near to equal power and equal freedom as is possible. In terms of autonomy, the idea is that people should have control over their lives, and that we must do this collectively, not individualistically. So an individual approach to trying to realize freedom doesn't work. I'll talk more about this later. In terms of democracy, this is the idea that we should collectively have control over our collective lives. We should have collective self-governance. And there is much missing from mainstream ideas of democracy, because democracy shouldn't be top-down, that's just about elected representatives governing over people. It should be at all levels. It should be based on engagement and people collectively having control over their collective lives. In terms of nature, non-human nature is valuable. It's not just an object, it's not a resource, it's something that we should revere. And earth democracy is the idea that non-human nature should have an active role in our politics, in our economy, in our legal system. So law and political change, and this is to be clear about what my argument is and isn't. My argument is not that law alone can solve the crisis we face. It's easy for someone to come along and say, I have a magic new idea. If only we changed this, everything would be great. Now, I do think changing this would be a significant contribution as part of the change that we need. But I'm not saying that law is this kind of approach to law, legal change is a magic solution. It's much broader. We need radical changes to our economic system, to our political system, to our society. Our value system and our worldview needs to change. My point is just that law must be part of this change. And the idea that interconnected law is trying to be the framework for what law should look like conceptually in that. Or at least it's something to get us further along to what law should be like. And it might feel like this sort of change is hard to imagine. And I mean, most days I agree it does feel hard to imagine it, quite far out of reach. But when we take a step back and think about the scale of human history is long. The idea that things might be different in the next couple of years is hard to imagine. But actually, if we think about the last 20 years, there's been a fair amount of change in the last 20 years or 10 years. It's not all good change, but my point is that the scale of change, when we think about kind of chunks of 10 or 20 years, the scale of change you can have over those times is actually quite significant. And this current moment in history has lots of change in it. Things are constantly changing, and positive change is very much possible and worth working towards. So that's the end of my interconnected law in summary section. So I have a note that I will take a short pause and see if there are any questions in the chat for me to cover. And I saw some of these coming in, but obviously couldn't take them in as we went. So let's have a look. Yeah, Tessa, I agree about feeling anxious for all the work ahead. Svea, I'm glad you
Alex,
liked that approach. Yes.
I have a question here.
Go for it.
Hey, thanks for a remarkable and very nice introduction, Alex. How long will this talk will take place?
Yeah, the presentation is until about 1.5 hours from now, or by now it's 1 hour 10 from now, and then there'll be an hour of discussion after that.
So your substantial issue to be highlighted is?
Yeah, so that's what I've just set out. This idea that our legal system should change, that this conceptualization of interconnected law for how we see humans, society, and law is a useful framework for that.
Come again?
All of the materials are also downloadable from the link that I put in the chat. So that
Alex,
can kind of...
you mentioned your conceptual framework. What's your conceptual framework?
Yeah, so I that's what I've just covered for interconnected law in summary. That's the section I've just covered for what I'm presenting as my conceptual framework.
Which is politic is interconnected.
It's this idea that we should understand humans as people who live in a dense network of relationships, social, ecological relationships, and that law is part of that, and that the role of law is to foster better and more harmonious relationships.
Okay.
And that's the summary I've got there. So I'll move on to the talk because much of it's going to be covered.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. I'm looking in the chat to see if there are any other questions while I spoke. Okay, I haven't noticed any jumping out. So I'll move on to systems view. The book there, Systems View, by Catford and Luisi. It's a book that had a big impact on my thinking. I'm grateful to the friend who pointed me to it. What they do in this book is they describe the rationalist paradigm, which has dominated modern understanding of the world. And they describe how this rationalist paradigm is being replaced in many subdisciplines by a paradigm that they describe as the systemic or the holistic paradigm. And they are setting out both a paradigm in particular disciplines, as well as a meta paradigm that covers different areas of human knowledge. which is a worldview or a meta paradigm. And a paradigm, for those who aren't familiar with the word, is a conceptual framework for how we interpret and make sense of the world, both individually and collectively. And as Capra and Luisi set out, this dominant paradigm, rationalistic or mechanistic, was, and this is one that sees the world as a machine. And in their words, the quote that's on the slide, the worldview and value system that lie at the basis of the modern industrial age were formulated in their essential outlines in the 16th and 17th centuries. So the idea here is that this rationalist paradigm that is still dominant in our law and our politics is outdated and has been supplanted in many other disciplines. And I'll also mention Jeremy Lent's work is about the cultural values of how we see ourselves. And that's all about the worldview, how societies, how cultures see the world and see themselves. So that's all, also great work on this same point. So Capra and Luisi, in their book, they set out how, in about the last century, in many disciplines, the rationalistic paradigm has been recognized as wrong and it's been supplanted by new ones. So to mention a couple, in physics recognizes a complex interconnection, that basically everything that exists interconnects with every other thing that exists. In medicine and biology, the human body is becoming better understood, not as discrete muscles, organs, and cells, but as a whole mind-body system. And part of this is also the way that medicine blurs into lifestyle and social contexts. And ecology developed as a discipline. So instead of being a biology that looked at individual organisms, ecology looked at the relationships between all the different living things in a particular ecosystem and the interrelations and feedback loops that are part of that. But as I said, in law, economics, philosophy, and politics, the mechanistic world as a machine paradigm is still the dominant one. And Capra and Luisi actually describe how the early liberal approaches to law were influenced by this mechanistic scientific approach. And they were seeking to replicate science in what became known as the social sciences. So conceptions of society, such as John Locke's, are atomistic conceptions, which extrapolated from the idea of atoms in physics and chemistry, and basically said, individual humans are like atoms. And when we collect all the individuals together, when we can have a mass of atomized individuals, this is society. And if you're interested in that, that's in Capra and Luisi's book. And of course, what I just set out is a very quick simplification. But one of the things I liked in the book was the way they described the tension between looking at the parts of something and looking at the whole of something. And they describe how this tension exists throughout all sorts of different particular knowledge disciplines. They trace it in classical thought. They trace it in the distinction between Eastern and Western philosophy. And of course, those are also simplifications to say something as broad brush as that. But the point here is that in a worldview, you need a balance of looking at the part and the whole, not only looking at the whole, not only looking at the part. And the argument that follows from this is that law is due a paradigm shift, which is what interconnected law is about. And when I was in earlier stages of my thinking, and this is the next slide, that's the one. There are kind of four main ideas that I've ended up bringing together. And after I read Systems View, it was clear to me that these are all ideas in the ecological paradigm. Before then, I had only noticed, oh, there's a similarity between Earth Jurisprudence and the relational approach. And I'm going to talk about those later in this talk. And this system and how the critiques that they're making are common. And then as well as, and this idea of a paradigm also allowed me to think of other things within medical law or approaches in contract law or in what was the other big one? Criminal justice. They all have scholarship that is in a systemic paradigm. And once I recognized that, I thought, oh, that's great. That's how interconnected law as a general concept can kind of link into ideas in particular disciplines. So that's the end of the section about systems view. I'm having a quick look through the chat to see if there are any questions. In general, it's best to just put questions straight in the chat. That's the quickest way of doing it. And I've seen a couple of good comments, but no questions. Oh yeah. Margaret's also said that the book was really significant in thinking it through. When I came across Margaret's work, it was amazing to see someone else engaging with the same work and the same thinking, and how aligned it was with what I was thinking about as well.
Alex, sorry to interject. Alex, sorry to interject. I unable to type the question. Can I post the question by way of oral?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, your idea or your thesis statement is about interconnected law, or interconnected law is in the essence is what?
Yeah, so this is, I think that sounds to me like the same question that I tried to answer in the previous section. And I'll come back to it at the end. The essence is we should understand humans as interconnected. We should understand our society as a network of relationships. We should see that law is part of this network of relationships, and therefore we understand law's role as about fostering harmonious relationships.
So law is a part of the relationship.
Exactly. So that's exactly what my next section is about to cover. So I'll answer that well. And a question in the chat from Sphere. Sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. To what extent am I aware of formal law education drawing on this paradigm? It's a good question. And in general, I think not that much. When I came across these works, it was really a kind of revelation to read Nedelsky's work, which I'm about to talk about, and Earth Jurisprudence, and Systems View when I came across that. When I think back to my legal education, the one thing I can think of is that my undergraduate degree finally did integrate different areas of law, because initially they were all treated as if they were discrete areas of law: contract law, medical law, criminal law, etc. And by the end of the degree, I could see how they were all linked together as a whole legal system. But I don't recall much about this idea of a paradigm of an individualistic approach versus other types of approach. I hope it now exists. My degree finished 6 years ago, so I'm hoping that in this time there's been a change. And of course, there are a couple of professors who introduced me to Earth Jurisprudence, but apart from that, I don't think it's been in there much. And Julia's question, that law has become very stuck and a negative force in society. Great question. That will be answered in, well, I'll attempt to answer that question in the next section. That's a very good prompt. And Mothi's longer one, that looks like a great point to pick up in the discussion later. So, the relational approach, and this section should be about 15 minutes, taking us to about the hour, and then we'll have a 5-minute break. So, as I said earlier, what I'm doing with interconnected law is rejecting the dominant individualistic paradigms and the worldview that exist in law and our politics and our culture. The idea is that we are not individuals who occasionally emerge from an individualistic island to travel to another metaphorical island and interact with someone else before returning to an individualistic existence. Instead, each person is embedded in a dense fabric of socio-ecological relationships. In other words, we are all interconnected. And to be clear, when I'm using the word relationship here, I mean all sorts of relationships. I don't just mean interpersonal ones or even just significant romantic ones, but any sort of relationship. And to map out a few different types of relationships that we have our social relationships, which go from intimate personal ones through to neighborhoods, communities, and broader society. We have economic relations, such as with employers, with businesses, with corporations. We have political relationships of all different types. And we have ecological relationships with our environment. We have forests, we have local parks, we have ecosystems, the places we get food from, the temperature of our planet and the climate as a whole. And all of these relationships I've set out are all enmeshed and interwoven with each other. And a key work I'm drawing from here is Jennifer Nadelsky's book, Laws, Relations. And what her book does is it sets out the relational understanding of people that I explained a moment ago. Her aim is to challenge the dominant liberal approach to law, which sees humans as discrete, freestanding individuals, and she argues for a relational understanding of humans, society, and law. And in this section, I'm mostly kind of just drawing on her work and covering that ground. And what she describes from what she's trying to do, she says at one level, what she's advocating is a shift in emphasis that moves relationships from the periphery to the center. But at another level, she thinks that even this shift is actually a whole change in how people see the world. So it's a shift in our worldview. And the questions which follow in this relational approach are questions like, how is law structuring relationships? And how should law be structuring relationships? So the relationships that we live in can be positive. We can have nurturing social relationships. Education is a positive relationship. Just employment and an environment which gives the physical conditions we need to thrive. Our relationships can also be negative, ranging from abusive interpersonal relationships, exploitative work relationships, racist and sexist social relations, or ecological environments which either don't provide for us or which are toxic. And Nadelsky also looked at various values and concepts, showing how many of the concepts that we understand as individual are actually heavily relational, including freedom and security. And she discusses freedom and autonomy at length in her book. She says that to treat autonomy as independence or control is to deny its inherently relational nature. And the typical liberal conception of autonomy is about individual independence and control. The idea is to be free, you must be able to control yourself and to control your kind of context, i.e. other people. And as well as being wrong, this is also an approach to freedom which can only leave a minority of people free, or which sees us all as separated people who should go and live on separate little islands independently. Instead, when we think about freedom, once we recognize that humans exist in a network of relationships, we should recognize that freedom is about those relationships. We need relations of freedom. All the relationships we live in have to be ones which give us the individual capacity and ability to act, which empower us and foster autonomy, instead of relationships which constrain or exploit. So now I'll move on to talk about law's role in the network of relationships we live in. And the point I'm going to make is not that law should do something about this. It's that law already is part of this. So our legal systems structure and influence many of our relationships. The quote that's on the screen, that's coming in a moment, thank you, yeah. We're just on the general slide with a subheading about law's role. So our legal systems already structure and influence many of our relationships. They don't do this alone. I'm not saying that the only things that are structuring the relationships in our lives are legal ones. I am saying that our legal systems are a significant part of it. So to give some examples, there are some relationships which are explicitly governed legally, such as marriage, partnership, and divorce, or obligations which attach to parent-child relationships. In interpersonal relationships, law is involved as well, such as, for example, in gender relations. So there were some obvious ways that law used to do this, such as women not being able to own property or a lack of agency that was given to women in marriage. To give a current example in the UK, this is an intersection of law and policy. The UK social security entitlement is linked to relationship situation. So someone is entitled to a certain amount of social security, which is called universal credit in the UK at the moment. If they happen to move in with their partner, it is assumed by the system that their partner will financially support them. So the fact of someone having moved in with someone else, if they are in a partnership, whatever that counts as, in this case, it's much less than marriage. It just means if they're kind of romantically a couple, then the payment to the couple is different. And that's a way that I think law or a legal aspect of policy affects relationships, because it makes it more difficult for someone to leave their partner. It affects the dynamic between the two of them financially. And it also means that it's harder for someone to leave the partner, because when they leave, they don't get this money until they reapply again. And that has the effect of trapping people, usually women, in abusive and controlling relationships. To give a couple of other examples, there are many everyday relationships between people and places that are controlled by law, such as who is allowed to walk where, or where skateboarders are allowed to skateboard, or whether people in parks are allowed to climb trees. And people who are undertaking protests, that's also governed by law. The legal system is giving a load of rules or limitations or effects of various types of protests. So anyone who is planning protests or undertaking protests, their activity is being affected by the legal system. And in employment law, while some protection is given in the UK by protection against discrimination or protection against unfair dismissal or a minimum wage, there is also the gap where all of the other things that law is not regulating leaves it to be just between the relationship of employer-employee. And given that that has a big power imbalance, that gap or that lack of law being involved creates a situation which allows the employer to exercise this power relationship. And to give another negative example of how law is creating conditions for exploitation is to mention UK immigration law. So in current UK law, many migrant workers who are on tier 2 visas are reliant on the job that they do to be able to stay in the country through a system of employer sponsorship. So the employer knows that their employee's right to be in the country is linked to having this job. And that means that that's a big threat to be hanging over them. If the employer fires this person, then they might have to leave the country. And that sets up a power dynamic. And for people who don't have regularized or legal status, they end up in a black market, which in the UK includes asylum seekers, because asylum seekers are generally not permitted to work, but they are stuck in a long legal limbo without much financial support. And illegal working is set up as a criminal offence, which means that anyone who's employing someone in this black market knows that the person they're employing or exchanging money with, because it probably won't be a formal employment relationship in a contractual law sense. They know that this person can't really go to the police or other authorities because they are themselves committing a crime. So people who are working in this black market are in a situation set up by the law, which makes it very easy for them to be abused and exploited. And I'll make a quick comment about the nature of law as well, which is to say that law has a kind of softer side and a harder side. The harder side of law is the strong coercive influence that law exercises, whether it's imprisonment, fines, the physicality of policing. And at the same time, law has this softer side, which is the more gentle and subtle influence about people who follow the law because they think it's the right thing to do, people who follow the law because they don't want to risk the punishment that comes with not following the law, or people who are influenced by law, even in this way that they're not recognizing. So this quote from Malatesta, which says, between man and his social environment, there is reciprocal action. Men make society what it is, and society makes men what they are. And if I were writing that, I would expand it to mean people of all genders and not just men. But the idea here is that while individuals have the capacity for independent thought, we are massively influenced by our social norms and our social thoughts. Norms established by law affect how we think about ourselves and about the world. So when law is giving this individualistic approach to life and focusing on individual rights, this encourages us seeing ourselves and seeing the world we're in this individualistic way. And this is about how the way law sets things out just affects how we think, which is a really big influence that I think isn't spoken about all that much. So that section covers how law is part of the relationships between people, about how it's structured, the power imbalances or balances, through from minor ways to significant ways. And I also had a note on this final one that law is inherently relational as an idea, as a system. Law is fundamentally about governing relationships between people, places, animals, and other things. And this is something that I didn't really recognize initially, because when law is described, it's always about the relationship between the state and the individual. It's about governing individual behavior. But actually the knock-on effect from that is that it is affecting our relationships. It's about how people interact with each other. So yeah, that was something when I read Jennifer Nadelsky's book, it struck me, and I couldn't tell whether this is something that was obvious or whether it was actually something I hadn't realized, or whether it actually is a revelation for how we think. So that's the end of that section, and we're about to take a 5-minute break. But before we do, I'll have a look at questions. Some great comments in the chat. Thanks for sharing those thoughts. How closely is this to the notion of legitimacy? Yes, it's definitely connected to legitimacy, because when we see law as legitimate, we are much more likely to take on the ideas that law puts forward and to follow law willingly. Whereas law that is not recognized as legitimate, so if it's much more a controlling or authoritarian regime, or an invasion that has law imposed on a people, then that does change whether people like to follow the law. Law will still in either case be influencing and structuring relationships, but definitely it's different psychologically. And there was a question about green justice issues, which I'll probably cover in the later sections. And someone asked, Mathia, yes, Robin Kimmer's book sounds great, it's on my reading list. And the question about how a relational approach would make a solution to the problems I outlined in immigration and employment. To give a very brief answer, people who are developing policy or ideas about the world would come up with how they think things should be. So it you have your end result of how it should look like. And then you can map out how things currently are, how law is part of the relationships that currently are, and then to get to where we need to be, what law should be like to create the conditions we need for a certain outcome. So one example for that would be a small one. You could give protection to anyone who reports labor abuse or abuse in a labor situation. You could say that they won't be punished for their disclosure. That would have other knock-on effects, so it actually becomes a very messy situation quite quickly. But that's hopefully gives a nudge to the kind of way I would think of things, or the way I would think of trying to use interconnected law to solve or to transform a particular set of relationships. Yeah, and then there's a question about whether law is insignificant when someone is acting solo. So yeah, if someone was acting purely in isolation, then law might still well be governing them depending on what the law says. It might still affect what they can do in their individual realm of activity. But given that I think most of human activity is about interactions with others and relationships with others, I think it's quite a small part of our experience. So I'll call a 5-minute break there. So we'll already start at 7 minutes past. And this gives you hopefully a bit of time to grab a snack, a drink, use a toilet if you need, or even if you're just in a chair, I encourage you to get up and move about a little bit if that's possible for you. And I'll start again in 5 minutes. So the next section is to cover Earth Jurisprudence, which I see as the ecological side of interconnected law. And when I started to think about interconnected law as a concept, it kind of came about from joining together the relational approach from Nadelsky with Earth Jurisprudence. And I initially saw these as one of them looking at the relationship between humans and the rest of nature, and the other looking at interhuman relationships. And then I realized they actually need to be integrated because all of these relationships are integrated. And when I think about interconnected law, one way I think about it is by saying it's Earth Jurisprudence, but applied to all of human activity instead of just the relationship with nature. Or sometimes I think this is actually a systems view thing. It's about the ecological relationships. All of the ecological and holistic approaches being integrated. But anyway, so Earth Jurisprudence started by a book called Wild Law by Cormac Cullinan, which I read shortly after finishing my undergraduate law degree. And that's kind of got quite a special meaning for me because it was the book that began my radical thinking about changing our legal systems. And it kind of re-inspired me with law after being quite burnt out from my undergraduate degree. And Earth Jurisprudence looks at the relationship between humans and the rest of nature. It looks at law's role in this, and it looks at how law should change. And the starting point is ecological destruction, that our planet, our natural world is being destroyed by us, and that this is bad both for nature and for humans. We are interconnected with nature. We have a multitude of ecological relationships with nature, as well as nature being valuable in its own right. And there are many ecological issues. Climate change is only the best known of them. We have habitat loss, wildlife in catastrophic decline, and decreased by 2/3 in the last 50 years, said one report. There's problems with soil quality being degraded. There's a scarcity of fresh water. And the general point is that we are fast exceeding what is sustainable and ecologically on a catastrophic pathway. And this destruction is interwoven in our way of life, our economics, our society, our politics, our culture, and of course, our law. We see the world as something that exists for us to use. Natural resources, quote unquote, are plundered unsustainably, chasing both corporate profit and a better quality of life for us in an economic system which is geared around profit. And we prioritize freedom in an individualistic, materialistic approach of well-being instead of prioritizing sustainability, care, and harmony. I make this point to show the scale of our problem, as well as moving on now to talk about law's role in this. And to give a quick language note, Earth Jurisprudence and interchangeably, but when I think of it, I call the conceptual idea and wild law being the specific laws or legal system. And I also consider Earth Jurisprudence to be part of interconnected law. There isn't really anything in Earth Jurisprudence that I don't agree with. I named it interconnected law as a way of covering not just the ecological relationships we have, but also the human ones as well. So Earth Jurisprudence situates ecological destruction with an almost spiritual, deeper problem, which is the perceived separation between nature. Sorry, which is to say that the perceived separation between nature and human beings is a fundamental cause of current environmental crises. And the point about law isn't just that our existing legal systems have failed to prevent the seriously harmful ecological destruction, but actually that law facilitates it. Law is part of the problem. And there's a quote from Cormac Cullinan, which I put in the presentation, which says, also the next one, which says that one of the primary causes of environmental destruction is the fact that our governance systems are designed to perpetuate human domination of nature instead of fostering mutually beneficial relationships between humans and other members of the Earth community. So our current legal systems are part of the problem and need to be transformed. And we can see this in property law, which sees humans as owners and the rest of nature merely as objects to be owned. Or we can see it in fundamental constitutional rights, where, and the function of our legal systems, that the only legal subjects are humans or human-related things like corporations or trusts. And for more analysis of how law is part of it, you can either check out the further readings or some of the writings on my website about Earth Jurisprudence, if you want to know more exactly about how law is part of the problem. So what Earth Jurisprudence says is that we should see ourselves as part of a broader Earth community, and that there should be a harmonious relationship between humans, the rest of nature, and each other. And sometimes this is described as ecocentric, but I prefer ecologically holistic. And the idea is that non-human aspects of nature are valuable and that we should live with them as part of a community. I mean, we already do live with them as part of a community, but we don't think of ourselves in that way. And there's not much of a community feel in the relationships between us and other parts of nature. And even our current environmental law is very much human-centered. And the idea of the environment is about the things that surround humans. And environmental law is about how we manage our relationship with our environment. And yeah, worth noting, this isn't a universal problem with all of humans. There are peoples, especially indigenous peoples, who do live in an ecologically harmonious way, or at least who used to until colonizers disrupted their way of life. So the next idea here is rights of nature. And this is the idea that non-human nature should be on an equal footing with humans in our governance systems, including in our legal systems. And the argument goes that nature has intrinsic value. In a rights-based worldview, it would follow that nature has rights in a moral sense. And then following through to the legal system, nature should be able to participate in our legal system to defend itself, defend its own value. And two things to add before I say a bit more about this. The first is that there is more to Earth Jurisprudence than just rights of nature. This is just one of the big standout ideas. And the second is that the end result, what's being aimed for, isn't to have rights for nature. The rights for nature are just a way that move us towards more harmonious relationships. The end goal is to change the world, not to just change the legal system. And this is also why I say that legal change alone isn't enough. It has to be legal change as part of all the other systemic changes we need. So the basic idea is that non-human aspects of nature should have rights so that they can participate in our legal system. And current environmental law, where it protects the environment, it usually does so indirectly. Rights for nature would instead allow nature to defend itself directly. So it would therefore be more effective because it would be directly about the nature's interest. And it would also mean that the default position is that nature has rights and can act to protect those rights instead of needing particular regulation or legislation from humans to protect a particular thing. And that's how environmental law has happened in this era. It's always piecemeal, it's usually after the event, and it means you have a patchwork of environmental regulation. Whereas rights for nature would give you a much more holistic, system-wide approach to protecting nature, or to allowing nature to protect itself. And the core of these rights, I think it looks like Margaret's internet dropped out, so we've lost the PowerPoint for a moment. But the core of these rights could be conceptualized as the right to be, the right to inhabit the ecosystem and the planet, and the right to fulfill its role in the Earth community. And specific rights would then be derived from its framework, and they would be different for different species or different ecosystems, and different depending on the context. And there was the Universal Declaration of Rights of Mother Earth, which I think was about 10 years ago, which set out a longer set of 13 or so rights, which all kind of have built out those 3 rights I described earlier. And rights of nature, thankfully, is not just an abstract idea. It has begun to be implemented around the world. Strangely, not that much has been written about it in English, and I think it's been a bit too niche, and also much of it has happened in Spanish. So Ecuador and Bolivia have both given nature rights through legislation. One of them was in the constitution, and the other was through a legislative framework, so made by the parliament. There are courts in Colombia and in India who have used rights of nature ideas to give rights for particular ecosystems in case law. And in New Zealand, there was a particular river system that was given legal personhood. So it's not rights of nature for the whole jurisdiction, but there was a particular river system that was part of the Maori people's way of life, that was given legal personhood. So the next section is the question of what would have rights. And I mean, I'll say in the Earth Jurisprudence section, this could have been a whole talk in itself. Necessarily for the length of this talk being a bit superficial in going through it. So there's the question of what would have rights, and then after that, I'll talk about how it works, how they're represented. So Earth Jurisprudence suggests a holonic approach. A holon is something that is both a part and a whole. So an individual animal is part of a collective, and collectives of animals are part of ecosystems. And you also have planetary systems. You can look at things on a planetary scale as well. And an ecosystem can be small, or it might be a network of multiple habitats, be a whole river system, for example. And the holonic approach looks at things at these different levels of scale, instead of reducing everything to either the smallest scale or to the larger scale. And this is also a good approach for understanding humans at our different levels of scale. And because of the way that the web of life is interconnected at different scales, you'd have to have rights at all levels. So individual animals having rights, I think follows, and I personally don't find that much that's difficult about that. I think where it gets more tricky and interesting is around communities and ecosystems, and also the whole planet scale. So ecosystem scale rights would protect habitats from destruction and interference, such as relating to land use or pollution. It's the ecosystem scale I think would be the most significant in terms of protecting the integrity of a whole ecosystem and all of the different things in it. And I think you could also use planetary level rights to talk about things on a global scale, such as climate change. There's also a question of who will speak for the trees. I've rearranged it compared to the slide. The question of how nature would participate in our legal systems. And I think I saw a question in the chat about this. So of course, trees cannot voice their wants themselves. Trees cannot advise their lawyers. So by necessity, it would have to be human representatives. And exactly what that would look like would need a lot of detail and would also be context dependent, and depending on the particular society, communities, and legal systems involved. But I will say that there is already precedent for humans representing interests that aren't their own. So a corporation has a board of directors that represents the corporation. It isn't about representing the individual director's interests, it's the corporate interest. In the same way, trusts have trustees and charities have a function that is not the benefit of the people in the charity, but usually anyway. So it's already relatively normal in this way for people to be representing a stated interest that is not their own. So if someone wanted to defend a tree, then you could have that as a nature's interest case, which would be a parallel of public interest that would allow anyone to come forward and say, I will invoke the rights of this tree to protect the tree. And the key difference in rights of nature is that the argument is about the interests and rights of the nature involved itself. If you want to know more about that, then Christopher Stone's essay, which I think is called Who Will Speak for the Trees, sets out the kind of difference between a right of nature that a human is invoking and a human's legal right that they're using for themselves. And this is also similar to how various NGOs, such as Client Earth, act on behalf of broader interests ecologically instead of based on human interests. And my belief here is in the process that people can collectively and democratically work through what is in the best interest of nature, of a particular ecosystem, and so on. And whether that would be a kind of citizens' assembly or a committee or a trust that would be established for a particular thing. For example, you could say that you set up a committee for a particular region, and the committee's role is to act to defend the integrity of nature in that area. Or you could say that a particular national park has a body of people that would have a mixture of scientists and local community members, and perhaps even just members of the public, whose role is to act on behalf of that particular aspect of nature. And of course, people won't agree. But if the conversation is about what is in the best interest of a forest, then that is a great place for the conversation to be, to work through the different arguments about what is in the best interest. Yeah. So when we talk about rights of nature, and I note there was a comment in the chat about whether rights are even the correct approach, which I have a lot of sympathy with. The end goal here isn't rights, it's the transformation that rights bring about. And having rights of nature would change the way our legal systems work quite fundamentally, but in a way that is actually already happening in our normal legal systems. And this isn't just because the legal system would be expanded to also cover nature's rights. The shift that I'm thinking of that goes further than this is that our legal systems would become about the relationships instead of about the rights. So traditionally, rights give a legal basis for a particular outcome. So a constitutional right can grant protection against a particular action by the state, or a contract right can demand a particular outcome from the other party of the contract. And the question about what rights are can get messy and complicated, so I'll leave it there as a superficial description. But when we get to rights of nature, what we're actually talking about is the relationship, because nature would have rights and there would also be human rights, which it would be directly in conflict with. So instead of law being about getting a particular outcome from someone with a right and something that is subject to that right, it would instead be about the relationship between rights holders. So someone says, it's my right to own this land and to feed myself using this land or to live here. And the right of nature would say, well, there's an ecological integrity here that is being interfered with. And the question becomes about a just and harmonious resolution of that relationship instead of about the outcome from a particular right. And this is actually, I think, something that's already happening in human rights law, that human rights law is being about the relationships instead of rights demanding a particular outcome. But it does depend on which part of human rights law. So the final couple of sections on Earth Jurisprudence. One is about what law's goal is. So Earth Jurisprudence says that the purpose of law is to secure the safety and future flourishing of the whole Earth community, and that the legal system should recognize and nurture interconnection and act for restorative justice, for sustainability and balance. And those are the parts of Earth Jurisprudence that I didn't have time to talk about here, for things apart from rights of nature that would change or should change. And with interconnected law, I expand this goal to say it's not just about relationships between humans and the rest of nature, that law's role is to work towards just and harmonious relationships of all kinds. And then the final thing to touch on is Earth democracy. So the argument that I've just set out there was about our legal systems, but the concept of Earth democracy, and there's a book called Earth Democracy by Vandana Shiva, which I'll admit I haven't read all of, just the introduction, but I thought it's still worth mentioning because this same argument about nature's interests, nature's rights being represented applies also to our political system, our economic system more broadly. And the idea that all members of the Earth community should be represented in our political systems, not just human ones, which would be a significant change to our democratic systems that I won't talk more about, but thought worth mentioning. So I see the chat has been quite busy, which is great. So I'll have a quick look and see if there are any questions that I can address at this stage, but probably most of these are going to be questions that we discuss in the small groups and then in the whole group discussion coming a bit later. But scrolling through to see if there's anything I can, that's a quick one to cover. Oh, yeah, an interesting question of holding nature accountable. So I would frame it that it isn't about holding nature accountable, it's about talking about the balance of the relationship. So could you argue that a tsunami has violated human rights? Isn't an argument that I think works, both because the tsunami doesn't have agency and also because the tsunami is just fulfilling its role in our planetary system. Tsunamis happen, and I presume there are various ecological benefits of such things, such that if you could press a button that says there are no more tsunamis ever, that would have various knock-on effects ecologically that would probably be bad. But yeah, the question of what would it mean for a just relationship between humans and the sea and how tsunamis fit into that would be an interesting one to look at in detail. That's an interesting prompt. Whether Earth jurisprudence is exclusively in favor of the rights of nature. So my idea would be you have your holistic legal system in which everything has rights. So humans have rights and nature, the rest of nature has rights. And then your legal system is about having just and harmonious relationships. So the rights of nature are exclusively about nature for the benefit of nature, but it's in the balancing with humans. And yes, you can have arguments about what the role of humans is in the Earth's ecosystem. And you can argue about the justice in that. And that kind of shifting to that point about what is humans' role in our ecosystem, in the planetary system and our local ones, is a great place for the discussion to be. And if what this legal system does is shift the question to what is humans' role in our ecosystem and where is the just balance between our interests and ecological interests, I think that's exactly where the discussion should be. Yeah. And scrolling through, I see Mafia's comment about rights being a relatively new legal approach. Completely agree. And one of the things is perhaps we end up in a new version of law that doesn't include rights as such, or at least it makes things different. Otherwise, that would end up getting us into, well, it's already getting us into bigger questions, which I think is what the section at the end for discussion is about. So I'll move through my final two sections. The next one is to touch briefly on social ecology, and then I'll finish off with a couple of final thoughts about interconnected law. So social ecology is kind of political theory and philosophy developed initially by Murray Bookchin in around the 1960s in the USA. And he was one of the first left-wing thinkers to look at the ecological side of things. Up until that point, no one, this was in the kind of first days in the UK and the US of thinking about ecology. And the argument it makes is that ecological destruction is part of social domination between humans, that our ecological relationships and our social relationships can't be separated. And therefore, addressing ecological destruction, to address ecological destruction, we must also address social domination. And I'm going to skip I'm going to go through the section very briefly, save a bit of time. But if you're interested in reading more, then you can download the materials and read the section, or you can read any of the written stuff about social ecology. And there are links on the website link to further readings. So the three main changes that social ecology challenges. One is to say that humans are part of nature, and Bookchin's writings have a lot of detail about what that means. And one of them, the one that stuck out to me the most, is we project our values onto nature. So we see nature as about competition and dog-eat-dog world, because that's how we see ourselves. And what we miss when we project is to see all of the cooperation that's part of nature. The second is, if we can't, you can't address ecological problems without addressing the social causes. So deforestation, for example, simply setting up a conservation zone around a forest doesn't stop the social causes of deforestation. And social ecology, I think, gives a very good framework for addressing social and ecological problems. And part of that, without going much into the politics, is that we have to recognize society not only as about the individuals in it, but about the social systems which make it up, which are all relationships of power. And then the final point is about democracy. Social ecology has a lot to say about democracy, and it has a vision of democracy that isn't about top-down representation. It's about everyone being involved in collective self-governance at all levels. So that was a very quick mention of social ecology. And I'll now come to my final section to finish off a few things about interconnected law. And after this, there'll be the transition lounge. And then after that, we'll have small group discussions. And then we'll come back after that for a large group discussion, or whole group discussion. So the recap of interconnected law is hopefully in a slide. So this is the kind of the summary, the takeaway slide, that humans are interconnected. So we should understand ourselves as individuals who exist in a dense network of socio-ecological relationships. Law should be based on this idea as, this idea of human society and nature. We should recognize that law is an important part of the web of relationships that exist in the way it influences structures and so on, and the relationships. And therefore, we should see law's goal as being to improve the web of relations we live in, to work towards a more just and harmonious web of relationships as part of a whole Earth community. So the next question is, what is law? Which is a big jurisprudential question, but I'm going to touch on only briefly. So law could be seen as a system of rules, which is either top-down, if there's concentration of power at the top, or in a pure democracy, those rules are self-governing collective rules. You can also see law as being a system of norms, which link into morality and other normative social things. We can also see law as being about decision-making to resolve conflicts. So there is a conflict, someone needs to decide. Law is the system we use to decide, which has rules and norms in it. And of course, in all of this, law is a system of power. The law is a big social institution created by humans, and it will therefore reproduce our power inequalities and social structures. And this can happen unintentionally, such as if someone is designing a building and they don't think about wheelchair accessibility, just because they don't think about it, that perpetuates the inaccessibility. Or law can be used intentionally to perpetuate particular social relations. And there are many examples of how it's used for this. And law's content therefore decides a lot about who has the power. And I bring this up to make the point that I'm not utopian about law. Law is a tool of oppression, and not inherently, not necessarily, but law is very much used as a tool of oppression by systems of power. And we must face up to this if we want to transform law. Law also has the potential for transformation. It can be used to improve things. And this is where I see it as working in a mutual way and symbiotically with social and political change. That you have to have enough of a push to make legal change. Then once you make legal change that has a feedback into the society and the politics, that hopefully is a positive feedback that moves us in a good direction. In terms of what I'm trying to do with interconnected law, the whole point is to say that law must be quite different. And there's kind of 2 or 3 parts to what I'm trying to do. The first is that this conceptualization helps us to think about how law as a whole needs to be changed. And I hope it gives a useful framework for how to think through legal and policy change in particular areas. And then finally, I think it has a use more broadly than law by talking about how our whole worldview, how our whole systems need to change. So I suspect most of the people I talk to about interconnected law won't then go on to work on law, but hopefully it's still, but the aim is that it gives this prompt of, oh, our systems need to change. This is an example of how they should change. And I see that as tying into the kind of systemic change that's in systems view, or Jeremy Lent's work about how our worldviews need to change, as well as all of the kind of economic and political movements for change. Then a comment I want to make about law's role. So the way I have described law here is very different to how law is normally understood in legal theory and among lawyers. And in traditional legal theory, in mainstream legal theory, law exists to protect individual freedom. And human rights law is an example of this. Human rights law is very much in the liberal and neoliberal worldview, where even though it's a transformative project, and even though it's trying to change society through law in a positive direction, it is still within the individualistic legal paradigm, because human rights is aiming to secure individual freedom, a certain type of individual freedom. And it's not looking about transforming relationships. It's about this individualistic idea of freedom. And that's not inherent to human rights. One of the arguments in my dissertation was that human rights can be transformed in the same way that Nedelsky was talking about, by thinking about creating relations of freedom. So realizing human rights, and the vision behind the Universal Declaration was that everyone should live in such a way that their human rights are fulfilled, are realized. That doesn't have to be done individualistically. You can do that by thinking about what does our society as a whole need to look like, and what does the legal system need to do to create those relational structures for people's human rights to be realized. So yeah, the traditional liberal and neoliberal approaches to law say that law should secure individual freedom. And once individual freedom is secured, that creates the kind of foundation in society that then means that people can engage in politics, they can do business, work in the private domain, and have their personal lives, and so on. And law's role is seen only as about securing this freedom. And these other domains are then seen as beyond law. And there are various boundaries for areas that are beyond law, such as whether something is a political question instead of a legal question, or if something is a personal thing instead of a legal thing. But yeah, all of those different boundaries are complicated and interesting. And I can't go into them in detail, but the general idea is that these are all interwoven. So once we recognize that law is involved in pretty much every aspect of human activity, there aren't general categories that law shouldn't go into. Instead, it's a question of what's the balance, or what's the role of law in these domains. Because what I'm trying to describe here might sound like I'm advocating a massive expansion of state power, which is an understandable thing to think I'm saying, because the law and the state are closely connected. So to respond to that potential argument, my argument is not that law should be involved in all of these areas. The argument is that law already is. And once we recognize that law is already involved, we should then harness the work that law is doing to make sure it's working in a positive direction. And then the second point is that I see law as being a fallback. The aim is not for a judicial society in which everything goes through law. It's that law acts when it needs to act, when other ways of resolving things have failed. But when law isn't needed, it shouldn't be at the forefront. It should step back and let people resolve things between people in a democratic way. That requires a kind of conditions of respect. It requires a relative equality of power. So law has to create those conditions. But then once that's involved, the aim is not a totalizing idea that everything should be resolved legally. It's about law as creating the structures within which things happen. So 2 final points to make. The penultimate one is about relationships instead of rights point. Currently we have our legal systems are based on rights, and relationships follow from those rights. And I think we would end up with our law focusing on relationships instead of focusing on rights. Rights are part of the relationship, but it seems to me that the relationship should be the focus. And you end up asking questions that are more about, is this relationship just? Is this relationship balanced and harmonious? And the rights are part of how you navigate that. And potentially in the future, a further future will be kind of beyond rights. And there's some interesting scholarship, one in the readings list on my website, that talks about what's wrong with rights and whether we move past the idea of rights. So the hope is that law becomes about mediating and fostering just and harmonious relationships. And sort of in common law, case law, that is kind of happening in the way that judges aren't just ruling on an individual case, they're setting up principles and precedents. But I do think there is still a shift to this relational goal and the way that a legal system would function to be more relational. And then the final point to make is about democracy and democratizing law. So as I said, my vision for law is not an expansion of state power. It's to have law as a system which democratizes power and distributes it more fairly and equally as part of cultivating more harmonious relationships. And I see this as similar to relationships such as mentors and teachers and other support figures, where initially, especially with children or someone who's a beginner in a particular area, someone is taught and supported and nurtured to develop their own capabilities. And then as they develop, the mentor or support person, whichever type it is, becomes less needed. And the person is then more on their own. And I don't think people ever become or should become independent. We always have these support relationships as part of interdependence. But my point is that the relationship changes. And this is how I see law, or how law should see itself. It's involved when it's needed. And then when the capabilities are developed, the social relationships are in a better state, then law kind of fades more into the background. And as I said earlier, I believe in democracy, and I believe that things are better when there is not a top-down exercise of power by a concentrated few, but when we are living and acting as a collaborative exercise with distributed and equal power. So democracy shouldn't just be about our political system. It should also be about our economy, our society, and our culture, that all aspects of our freedom should be controlled collectively and democratically distributed. And as part of that, I think the legal process should itself be more democratic. It should encourage people to work together instead of to go against each other, where an argument that becomes a litigation or a court case is the last resort. Law should be part of guiding people to live well together. And to give a couple of ideas for what this might look like, there'd be more alternative dispute resolution, more mediation, more community engagement to resolve conflicts, and then more things like citizens' assemblies and stakeholder representation as part of what is currently a judicial process. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. I can see there's been a lot going on in the chat, which is great. And I suspect that these are mostly questions for the big discussion that we'll have in the kind of latter sections. There was a question about whether my dissertation's published. It's not been published, but I'm happy to send it to anyone who's interested. My dissertation was about human rights and Earth jurisprudence, and whether they kind of, when they talk to each other, what's going on? Are they compatible, or can they be compatible? Interconnected laws, theory of change. It's a good question. I don't exactly know how to describe it as a theory of change, but I see it as symbiotic with other systems. And I mean, perhaps you asked that question before I said more of things in the last section that talk around that type of question. But I do not have a succinct theory of change that I'm able to articulate. So yeah, I'll finish there. And who am I handing over to for the next section?
Thank you so much, Alex. I enjoyed that tremendously, and I can see from the chat that, yeah, everyone is engaged with what you're saying, and we can't get to the part where we are all going to talk with each other and explore some of the themes that you shared. Before we do that, one of the things we like to do in every masterclass, because this is a 3-hour masterclass where it's a lot of head work. We're sitting, we're listening, we are learning from the lead facilitator. We try to practice what we preach by implementing a holistic engagement in these masterclasses, which is not only head, but bringing in heart and spirit and body into it. And for this, we are now going into what we call a transition launch. And in this transition launch, we'll be inviting you to connect more with your body, check in with where you're at, your breathing, and really center yourself, set your intentions for the discussions that we're going to have and what you're hoping to get out of the discussions and take on at the end of this masterclass. And for that, we'd like to invite Alyssa, who is our resident in-house transition launch facilitator. She is a breath work practitioner, and she really can, she leads us in this experience. Alyssa, are you here? And guys, I mean, we encourage you all to stay for this, or if you want to use it as a bathroom break, you can as well, if you're not into this. Alyssa, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Okay, let me stop sharing screen. Do you need screen or anything, or?
No, no,
okay.
no.
Good,
this is good. Once you can hear me well, all's good. Thanks so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Alex and Margaret and Anya. As Margaret said, it's a lot, and I think Tessa was saying that sometimes the implications for doing this work can feel pretty challenging. So let's take some time to just tune in and look at integration with our breath. Yeah? Okay, so first, I'd like to invite you to notice where you are. Look around the room you're in, the space you're in. First, move your head a little bit. And then you can come back to center and just notice what you see in the front of you and see what's in your peripheral vision now. And look out as far as you can see. If you have the luxury of a window, look through the window. If you have the joy of a horizon, look at the horizon. And if a wall is the furthest thing away from you, just look at the wall. Now soften your gaze. That is, don't look at anything in particular. Let your eyes rest for a little bit. And notice your feet on the floor. Notice where your body is in contact with the thing that you're sitting on or standing if you're using a standing desk. Consciously experience the feeling of being supported. Begin to notice your breath. And if it's safe for you and not challenging and you feel resourced enough, you can let your eyes drift closed. And we begin to do perfect breaths. You can begin to breathe in and out for 5. We'll breathe in, 2, 3, 4, 5, and out, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can keep going, and if that feels a little challenging or you have tightness or it's uncomfortable, breathe in and out for 4 or 3 or 2. Just make the in and the out count even. Keep going. I'll mind the time. Just notice what's happening as you make your breaths even. We're all still here together. Keep breathing. If you've been doing a 2 count, see if you can go up to 3 breaths, 3 counts in and 3 counts out. Only a few seconds more. Keep going. Take a moment and switch your attention from your breath to your heartbeat. Breathing and the heart are an integrated system, and they work together so beautifully. The heart actually makes space for the lungs. From here, we can actually put a hand over our heart or on the center of our chest, or we can bring both hands to the chest. if it feels good to you, just take a moment to be grateful for your heartbeat and for your breathing. Our heartbeats are as unique as our fingerprints. Just stay there for a minute, and sometimes that might bring up some emotion, and give that some space. And if it feels challenging, you can open your eyes. Now let's match the breath to the heartbeat. Breathe in and out and match the inhale and exhale. Keep them even, but when you breathe in, do so on your heartbeat, your own personal rhythm. When you breathe out, match the out breaths to your heartbeat. So you might breathe into one heartbeat, into two heartbeats, into three heartbeats, into four heartbeats, out to one heartbeat, out to two heartbeats, out to three heartbeats, out to four heartbeats. Notice what happened when you matched your breath to your heartbeat. Notice anything else that's happening in your body. Is there tingling anywhere? Do your feet feel cold? Do your hands feel a little warmer? Are you noticing the backs of your heads? Or your seat? Or your chest? What happened when you took a moment to send appreciation to your heart and your breathing? You can release your hands to your lap now. And we'll do a breath that balances, that is said to balance the right and the left hemispheres of the brain. It's alternate nostril breathing. If you're familiar with it, you can start. And if you need a little guidance, you can open your eyes and look at me. You need your thumb and your fourth finger. You cover your right nostril. Exhale through the left. Inhale through the left. Cover your left nostril with your ring finger. Exhale through the right. Inhale through the right. Cover your right nostril with your thumb. Exhale through the left. Inhale through the left. Cover your left nostril with your ring finger. Exhale through the right. Inhale through the right. And keep going. And just notice if it's easier to breathe through one side than the other. Our bodies do this change or shift naturally during the day. The nose is an unexpected place that you'll find erectile tissue. And we adjust the breath during the day, or the body adjusts the breath during the day. Be easy, don't force it. Sometimes you find there's one nostril, you get no air through. Keep going. If you feel dizzy, go back to even breaths. Okay, let's all come back to even breaths. Release the nostrils and just notice, just see if there's anything different. Move your shoulders a little bit. Move your head a little bit. You know, sometimes we can wiggle a little bit. We all get, you know, so serious. You can, you know, shake your shoulders, do a little shimmy, and just see how you feel in your body. Notice again how it feels to be supported. Pay attention again to your heartbeat. It's wonderful to be in a state of relaxed attentiveness where we're ready, we feel empowered and flexible and ready to go. And the breath gives us the ability to do that. Okay, after we've shaken ourselves a little bit, now we'll just even things out before we get back into session with Alex and into discussion. So we'll do briefly something called the Darth Vader breath. And it sounds kind of like, just make a little constriction in the back of your throat. Just try it out and see how it feels. Again, if you feel a little faint or you feel a little dizzy in the head, just come back to even breaths. As we get into discussion, that breath, which is called Ujjayi in the pranayamic tradition, enlivens us and helps us to speak. It also helps to energize the system a little. A few more seconds of Ujjayi. And then we come back to a few even breaths. Just take 3 or 4 even breaths. And as you do that, just look at what I'm doing here. We'll take a deep breath in and sigh out. Deep breath in. To just let go of anything else, any residual that we might be holding on to. Give the anxiety an opportunity to leave. Let's try that. Breathe in. Sigh out. Breathe in. Either with a sound or just let the breath go. This one you can exhale through the mouth one more time. A couple more in and out breaths. Breathe in. Let the breath go. Breathe in. Let the breath go. Notice how it feels to be here in this group. As we come back, thank you so much for taking the time to take the time with your breath, with yourself, in this interconnected system we're a part of. I'll hand you back over to Margaret and then to Alex. Thank you so much.
Ashe, Melissa. All right, Alex.
Again, and thank you so much for doing that. I do feel so much calmer now. So next up, we're having small group discussions. Anya, is it just going to be allocation into random ones, or do you have? Yeah.
We can also make sure that everybody chooses their own rooms. So that's also a possibility, but otherwise can be random.
Okay, so I think we want 4 groups.
Okay.
So yeah, we'll go into 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I had a few suggestions for what the groups could include on the WhatsApp, but if that doesn't work, random will work as well. And in each group, it's about 20 minutes. We'll come back together at past. And there are a set of prompt questions for you to discuss. I'm putting them in the chat now, but they will also be in a Google document, because the idea is that I'm going to give you a Google Doc that you then can collectively take notes on, and that gives you a focus of something to write down, and also means that I can see what's going on in the discussions. So the Google Doc link that I've just put in the chat, that should take you to a document. Great, I can see people are joining it, which then is a link tree to other Google Docs. So each group has their own Google Doc, and depending on the number of the groups you're in, you go to the document with that number. And the questions are in those Google Docs as prompts. I'm not expecting you to cover all 3 questions. It's more like pick one of the 3 questions, maybe 2 of them, to see what you feel like discussing. And yeah, this is the opportunity to discuss and learn from each other and see, you know, it might be that someone didn't understand a particular thing in what I presented, or someone else had issue with it, and then that can be discussed. And then after that, we'll come back to the bigger group, and that'll be a more organic discussion. But you can bring through questions that didn't get resolved in the small groups. You can share what you discussed in your small group. You can, yeah, ask questions, give opinions, etc. So hopefully that makes sense. Does anyone have any questions on that now before you get sent into a breakout group?
Let's discuss his stuff, right?
Yeah.
I realized we started, both of us, and it started from a different place to get to the same point, right? So he started from relational law and Earth jurisprudence, then found Fritjof and looked into social ecology, and is now, you know, because Fritjof really leads you straight to deep ecology, and deep ecology includes social. So there's no division between social and ecological, right? And so I found that interesting, his pathway to it, because my pathway was directly from rights to Fritjof, which is a systems view. And then that systems view led me to complexity. I noticed that in his stuff, Derek is here again. I noticed that in his presentation, he doesn't engage with complexity at all in terms of like complexity theory and complexity science, right? And so, yeah, so I see the complexity theory and science as a different epistemological frame for dealing with the interconnectedness, right?
I'm gonna pause.
Exponentially more difficult. We also talked about the speed at which things need to change, the sort of dynamics and flexibility of national systems, and how that can be quite challenging, because obviously national legislation deals with decision making that affects so many different types of people in different ways. So therefore the subtlety or sensitivity that can necessarily be applied at a local level becomes naturally much more difficult. And then Andrea touched upon a local governance structure that's been spearheaded in Bologna, which shared a PDF. And I mentioned the sort of technological applications of systems like blockchain, for example, that could help with governance and decision making, but then how certain systems will always isolate certain communities at a socioeconomic level, or based on their education, or perhaps even their confidence to engage with such systems, and how it's often the more polarized sides of a community or society that tend to make their voices heard, rather than the more sort of central opinions. So you know, is it a wisdom of the crowds sort of approach, or, you know, how do you sort of create a hierarchy for those decisions to be made at a collective level or an assembly level? That was it, I think, in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you, Krishan. And group 2, Alex, who was in group 2? Do we know?
Who didn't put their names on the document, but I think it had Mothir in it, and Tessa and Alyssa.
Mothir is being dragged to
Alyssa, do you want feedback? So, Tessa?
I think you can take it, Monsieur. I mean, I've been jabbering on about breathing for, you know, have at it, have at it.
Yeah, okay. Well, through the breathing, there was 5 of us in the group, but unfortunately the voice wasn't working, another wasn't visible, and so there's just those 3 most contributing, and yeah, so Alyssa brought in the perspective of language, because she looks, she's a linguist as well. So I'm just going back to this question around how do we just thinking about the relational construct that language creates. So when Tessa, for example, said we need to go back to nature and to, you know, we're already creating a relational construct through a metaphor of nature being this pristine that we go back to. So there are, in the metaphors themselves, there is as much a relational construct as the law itself. So there are 2 levels of relational constructs going on. And so how do we, and then Alyssa was talking about that, that was important, that rather than just, the important thing is how do we talk with each other, understand each other across different groups and different ways of looking at the world. And I sent a link to this Telegraph article, which, if people don't know, the Telegraph is the most right-wing or conservative newspaper in the UK, but it was an article saying, I'm going to lose all my friends by saying this, but climate change is real, but let's not let the radicals take over, and in their philosophy. So it really opens up this field that actually what's at stake is our different philosophical ways of looking at the world and how we are underneath it, battling with the metaphors by which we understand the world. That's kind of what we're trying to work over. The line, what we were talking about was how do we, are there ways we can understand each other better by trying to really ask questions about how we understand, so we can build a capacity for critiquing. And that was sort of beginning to think around whether that could begin to a theory of change by looking at that, by looking at those kind of, what practices can we begin to develop for how we would make interconnected law manifest itself. Yeah.
Group 3. Does anyone know if they were in group 3?
Yeah.
Svea.
So I'm going to use this jolly Google Doc, which impressed me, but nevertheless, is to say there were 2 questions, Alex, and you know, plenary, which was one from Joy Marie Lawrence, who said, is there a hierarchy within interconnected law, and when does one right trump another right in this way of thinking? And Elise had also a question about interested groups, ecosystems. You can see how do we define and how can we define them? So they might like to ask those questions directly, but then what we spoke about a little bit was space law and in the boardroom, how decisions are made that somehow exclude certain stakeholders, or that the impact of decisions made in boardrooms is perhaps not thought about in a wide enough way, and how might how might we think in a more relational and interconnected way about these impacts that move beyond profit. So I think maybe I would like to ask Jo Marie and Elise would like to pose their questions, and whether you want to take them now or at the end when everyone's had a turn, you know, each room has been able to say something about their interests.
I think thanks for the questions. Yeah, those are great questions. I think let's hear from group 4 and then we can come on to questions. Thanks.
Say something for group 4, but others please chip in. There were mainly 3 of us contributing, and I started with going for number 3 because of my interest in the international law against ecocide, which I found it heartening that, of course, the shift in the paradigm has to be a shift in our relationship with nature and the environment, and that we are nature. But this is me and my interest, and to be fair to the group, there was concern that international law was something hard to relate to from another member in the group who had a lot of problems seeing how people in a situation of difficulties with employment would be affected. So I suggested a strong part of this interconnected law could involve the universal basic income idea. And yeah, and then I was concerned about the human right to a healthy environment and wondering, because this is relational rather than based on rights, it seems like another step ahead of where we're at, because I've been involved so long to make these interconnections with nuclear weapons, for example, and the right to a healthy environment, and for people to be able to relate to it as something that is absolutely a priority for the future generations who won't exist unless, you know, these existential threats are addressed. This is basically me. So I would like the other members of the group now to say.
Well, that was pretty cool, actually, and I think it highlighted the problem as kind of we experience it, and that is that there's a systemic, bigger issue, wider issue, the outside, and then there's the little tiny people that are connected to it. And while you were talking, Rosalind, I was thinking about a lot of the First Nations work in Canada, and there was the lawyers who come from First Nations backgrounds who are now qualifying would, you know, be able to relate to this discussion. So the fact that people in the communities are fragmented about whether they want oil pipes or not, and there's a big fight in the family about whether or not you are pro or against, but also whether you support or don't support the protection of the environment. So actually, I think it summed up the system individual problem, you know, the basic me and the people dying around me, and the bigger problem where it is situated, which is in a wider international law forum. So yeah, sorry, Letitia, did you want to add something? John didn't say anything, so I don't know if he's there or not, but thank you. I appreciated that.
Thanks. We really wanted the grassroots to have more impact and more information to be able to impact. Yeah.
Great. So yeah, thanks everyone for sharing from each group. And I'll take some of the questions now. So the ones that's fair. Okay, is there a hierarchy within interconnected law? And how do rights trump other rights? It's a great question. I think the way I would think of it, I mean, in approaching this, I try not to think that I have to come up with all the answers, and instead there's a framework, and how do we use the framework to answer the questions? So in a particular relationship, I think the question is, what's a just and harmonious relationship? And then within that, there will be things that outweigh other things. There's a difficult question of who decides, and when there are conflicting worldviews and values, how that works out. But ultimately, there does have to be a point when something wins out over other things. So there would have to be hierarchies of sorts. An approach I've seen to rights that I think would be really useful here comes from German constitutional law and human rights, which is to look at the core parts of rights. So like our right to life is a very core part of our right, whereas a more peripheral part of that right would be more around like health, but in a less core way. So it's obviously health is still important, but it doesn't go to the core of the right to life. And if you look at an ecosystem, you can have the same question of to what extent something is at the core of the integrity of an ecosystem or is more limited. So yeah, that's how I think of it. Instead of hierarchies, more about the core of something. And then I think there'd also have to be more broadly agreed values, such as sustainability or ecological integrity or human dignity, that would be values that would help decide conflicts or legal situations. So it's the hierarchy would come from the values, I think. Hopefully that answers that. There was a question about defining interested groups or interested ecosystems. I think that's a good question. I don't think I have a particular answer for it, apart from to agree that how you define the scope of something is really important. And my general belief is that democratic is help to resolve that. So someone is interested if they consider themselves interested, but then within a discussion, people can discuss who is more interested or the extent of their interest. And yeah, Mothia, come and ask a question before I move on to another one.
Oh yeah, so thanks. It's actually not just used to the group, and the question is whether a working group on some particular thing that has been, I think, bothering me a bit, but just since that space question about the law of space, about these unexplored territories where you can begin to bring something new in. I've been thinking a lot about, well, not thinking, but there is, and with XR as well, which I'm part of, the deep sea mining regulations, which held by the, I don't know which body it is, but the regulations coming in a couple of years. They haven't actually got, but this is about to happen. And it's when you think about, the West traditionally thinks of things as an open territory, you can just go and extract. And how would you begin to think about interconnectedness as a means in which to actually petition a different way? First of all, you don't want it to happen, but the second thing could be, if it does happen, how do you do this is it possible even to even think of it as an interconnected way? I'll just forward the article there, but it's just, I'd like to even think a bit more about that. So if there are people who are interested in just surfacing a bit more thinking around this, because it's the Intersea Bed Authority, I think they're called. And they're a tiny UN body which had no powers at all, and now they're like at the heart of this huge new Wild West that's about to happen. So a lot of commercial bodies are just pushing forward their ideas of what the regulation should be. There's hardly any counterforce, so I think, around alternative ways to think about it.
Yeah, thanks. The thing that brought to mind for me was also about, if we're thinking about things like a hierarchy of values, we should certainly be thinking in a long-term, sustainable, ecological way. So mining, any mining permit, whether it's deep sea or a coal mine on land, those are all chasing the short term at the cost of long-term ecological integrity. And in general, I think long-term issues or integrity should outweigh short-term interests. But yeah, I didn't know anything about that deep sea mining and UN body, so thanks for sharing that. Any other thoughts on that point before I move on to a different question?
Just to say that the ecocide law actually recognises that there needs to be a priority of protecting the earth rather than giving profit to shareholders, which is a game-changing proposition, basically, I would say.
Yeah, and I really like that the ecocide movement, or I don't know how you would talk of it, has done a great job of raising the profile of the idea of a crime of ecocide. And I think that ecocide as a crime, both internationally and domestically, would be an important part of Earth Jurisprudence. And it kind of follows that if nature has rights, then one of the effects of having those rights would be that it would be a crime to harm ecological integrity. And that would make sense. That's how I see ecocide law as fitting in, kind of at the international law level and at domestic levels. Okay, then I'll take the question, just scrolling through, about corporate. Question, was it from group 2? I was just looking at Google Doc to find the question about boardrooms.
That was group 3.
Group 3, thanks. Oh yeah, great. So yeah, the question was about how decisions are taken in a corporate boardroom. And when I think about this, the way I try and think about it is by thinking through the relational context. So what are all of the relationships that a particular corporation has? And usually it involves the people who work at the company, the people who buy the products, depending on what type of product or service it is, and the local communities and society that the business activity is situated in. And for a multinational company, that will be anywhere it has an office, and it will be whatever the scale of the impact is. So most large corporations have a national level impact. And then it's also all of the ecological impacts, which also there's a lot to map out in an ecological impact. And thinking democratically, I think that all of those stakeholders should be having an input into the activity that affects them. It's applying the idea of the kind of general democratic principles that we apply in the political sphere to the economic sphere. And for those different interests to be taken into account, it seems to me that it follows from that those have to be taken into account in the board of directors. So I would propose something quite radical, like replacing the board of directors with a board that represents all of the stakeholders. The shareholders can be one of the stakeholders, but would only be one of the stakeholders. Other stakeholders would include the people who work there, local community and national community. That can include supply chain as part of that impact if they aren't employees, and kind of ecological representatives. And then I think that board that represents all of those interests could then make decisions about what's in the best interest holistically. So ecological interest, public interest, the interest of the company. And that would be a way that would restructure the corporate profit motive from just doing business activity that gives profit back to shareholders. And that is, of course, quite a big radical proposal that would change corporate law, but that's how I would think it through in this kind of interconnected law way.
Just to jump in on that, Alex. So, and I like the proposal, to have the different interests and all of that. And how would we then think about the expertise? Because the approach right now for putting persons on a board is, you get the people of different expertise, the legal person, the finance person, the risk person, that kind of thing. So if we were to take that approach, how do we integrate the expertise as well? The representative approach with the expertise approach?
Yeah, I mean, definitely that is a big question. I don't think I have an answer to it in terms of if you're saying that all these different representatives need to be on the board, who decides which person represents each issue? That's a big question. Probably you'd have a broader board, so you could have a kind of general ecological representative group that could then select some people to put forward, kind of like an equivalent of if environmental NGOs were deciding who to put on the board. Then they could be selecting for themselves, because of course you wouldn't want the shareholder interest influencing which ecological representative they have on the board. But I think that would be a broader question to be figured out democratically.
Maybe a two-tier board. A two-tier board.
Yeah.
Yes, Joy.
Can I come in?
Go for it.
Yeah. So thanks, Alex, for that. And it's interesting, in South Africa, we have, certainly from a corporate, we've got the King's Code of Good Corporate Governance. And interesting, there's been a shift which takes it away from a shareholder perspective to a stakeholder inclusive approach, which now mandates those companies, and particularly listed entities, that adhere to and follow King Code to be able to demonstrate and report on how they are taking a stakeholder inclusive report. So in other words, how are you engaging with your communities? What work have you done for the employees or engage with the employees? So that's one way of trying to make sure that boards are more aware of and inclusive. Yes, sometimes they pay lip service to it, and others can be quite engaged. Another approach is absolutely the idea of, Mary Rose just alluded to it, having sort of a two-tiered board system where you have, I know the German system has the advisory board and then the main board, but that's another way in which you can get perspectives and interest while also maintaining that balance of fiduciary and confidentiality and making sure that the directors are applying their minds, but acting in the best interests of the organization as well. So yes, useful discussions, and this is a topic we can also have for another day in terms of how we become more inclusive. But when you start mandating companies to report on how are they taking the environment into consideration in making their products, in engaging with communities and ecosystems, you bring that awareness that they need to start thinking about it more carefully. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing that. And that sounds interesting in South Africa. I guess the next step is to move from just reporting to power and decision making as a kind of further step. But that does sound very much like it's better than in the UK. Margaret, is it time to wrap up, or do we take a final question or contribution if anyone has one? Or
does anyone have a final contribution or question before we close? Andrea?
I don't know. I think I found all the discussion very interesting. I think, to me, the question is how we can, I don't know if I use the correct word. I am not a legal person. I'm an activist. So the question is how we can, I read some article about generative law. So a law that is able in some way to generate possibilities. And to me, what is important about the law that is in Bologna is about managing the common goods, is the possibility to define agreement and define pact, and each pact define what are the rules, and what are the power, and what are the aim that the specific pact want to do. Because it's not possible to define that solving one problem is equal every place in the world, in every city, in every neighbor. Each place is completely different and timing is completely different. So how we imagine the law that is a tool to empower people, communities, and group of citizens to make decisions. Not to thinking to have the best law possible or the most progressive law possible, because every time is depending on where you look in the problem. But the question is how we spread the power, how we give the other people the ability to manage the power. I think also what you said about this is, to me, is the very important point. And need to be very also practical, probably starting in the local level. I think the municipal level is one of the point of starting, not solve the problem about all the problem, particularly the environment problem that are not local. You need a national and international scale, obvious, but I think in some way we need to start the discussion. To me, it's very interesting. I don't have a solution. This is what personally I think is very important to develop in the next time, to define a new way to manage city, new way to have a new municipality, new way to agree, put together, new way to make election. I don't think so that the election is only one way to make election. So I think this kind of reflection is very important.
I think it's a fascinating idea. What you're sort of describing is this sort of high resolution, super cost efficient way of running a referendum. If you could run hundreds of referendums simultaneously on different issues that are being decided at a national level, and get the sort of the wisdom of the crowds to to sort of figure out different ideas at different stages. People could engage with that. It could be enormously powerful, but I think the practicality and cost of and obviously security of such systems as well is, it's a really tough nut to crack.
This it can be used. To me, the question is how we develop tools that are collective, that are not individual people, that are called to say what you think about. That is very problematic because there are people not thinking about a lot of stuff, and people sometimes don't have too much knowledge about what is the question. But still, using this kind of tool is important, not for everyone, but to me it's important how we can build in collective activity, where we put together to find the solution, not individually or just to count who is majority of the people is. Also because there is some count that are very complicated. If I ask all the residents in my neighborhood if we need to keep out the homeless, I suspect that the majority of the people said give out the homeless from our neighborhood. So at some point, counting is not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, of course,
Yeah,
it's quite easy to hide behind your decision or your vote as well. I suppose. I mean, just speaking from a sort of a marketing point of view, I'm sure there are ways in which you could potentially incentivize communities or individuals at a taxation level to engage with such decision-making processes. If there was a sort of a kickback, for example, for every micro referendum, for argument's sake, that you engaged with, I'm sure people would be far more likely to engage. If you can incentivize people to help that decision-making process, it might work. But as you say, yeah, there's always going to be that challenge of if majority rules, then it could affect a minority in a negative way, and that's a challenge.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Andrea. That sounds really positive about Bologna. I don't know whether there are, well, presumably there will also be problems with it, but that sounds like exactly the sort of approach that I would have in mind. And definitely social ecology also thinks that the municipal level is the best place to be targeting for the relationships between people at the municipal scale, because people can get much more involved than at a national scale. And that sort of stuff is exactly how I see interconnected law, see the role of law in this way, for how is law structuring people to be democratically involved. So yeah, that sounds great. Thanks for sharing it.
Yeah. And that little discussion between Andrea and Christian just took us back to the founding of democracy, you know, majority rule versus representative, decision making, where the experts are said to have more knowledge and can make the decisions for us. I think we should close it up, but I do want to say thank you to all of you for coming and joining in the discussions. I did have a question for Alex, but I don't want us to go on for too long. What I wanted to say was this: Alex, Future Law, and you, and I have come to this from different approaches, but we've come and we do share your view on this interconnected law and capturing it in this way. The way Future Law had phrased it was complexity-informed law and complexity-informed legal system change and meta-legal. But, the way you have packaged it in interconnected law, you're bringing in Earth Jurisprudence, relational law, social ecology, and then systems view, I think is incredible. What I'm wondering, just this last question to you, you know that there is the integrative law movement, right? That, oh, well, this is quite a huge movement. It includes practitioners in many different areas. So in the area of contract, doing conscious contracting, and in the areas of wills and estates, conscious wills or something like that, in justice, restorative justice approaches. And in almost every area, they're trying to rethink how we practice the law in a way that that recognizes the interconnectedness of all life. And so I'm wondering, so when I came across, what you're doing, what you're capturing, I saw interconnected law as the new ontology, a new ontological underpinning for the law. Like, what is the nature of reality? The nature of our reality is that we are interconnected. And I see integrative law practitioners, the methods, they are finding different ways to implement it, as each of us can do. One of the things that wasn't brought into this masterclass, but I think is certainly is an epistemological approach to this interconnected law, is complexity and complexity science, which will then seek to answer some of the questions that I saw being asked, like how do we balance between certain rights, and how that Andrea was asking as well, because complexity lends us certain concepts, right, that we can then use, and then tools and concepts that we can use, understanding non-linearity, emergence, self-organization, dissipating structures, power laws, and all these things coming out of complexity that help us to understand this interconnectedness, and therefore how we can create and influence just and harmonious relationships, which is what I think we're all coming together to do. So I want to really thank you, Alex, for this. I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot to ask you what do you think about interconnected and integrated. I just wanted to share that from Future Law's perspective, guys. It's clear to us that doing it in a piecemeal fashion in different disciplines is fine to a certain extent and not coming against the great work that's being done. But we could be working against each other if we stay in our silos and we're only seeking to reform in our silos, which is why these types of discussions come before, you know, what we're doing, you know, to deal with the homeless and what we're doing to address, you know, ecocide, right? These discussions about what is informing the way that we come up with new policy and new approaches in the law. And so I'm really excited about, and I do want to say publicly that, you know, we've been phrasing it complexity informed law, we've been phrasing it meta legal, but Alex, I really, Anya and I have reflected on your work, and after this masterclass, we are going to be aligning our work with yours in terms of interconnected law, that Future Law is promoting this concept. Future Law is, really trying to elevate the understanding of this concept, because you try to pull everything together beautifully that many different people are trying to talk about and talking about it in their own respective niches. And I think it's really important, the discussion that was raised about space and marine deep sea mining. These are the two areas that we're going into, and what is going to be our philosophy for how we relate, for the relationships, the just and harmonious relationships we engage in there. So thank you, Alex, for this generous 3 hours of a deep dive into this, which is just a start, guys. It is just a start. We have the resources at the link. If we can put the link back. Yes, Kim Wright is leading the integrative law. Yes, and Kim Wright is she's been part of the work that we've been doing. She was part of our summit and is one of the experts that we pull on, and we'll probably be doing a masterclass in our 2022 series, because we are filled for this year. But absolutely. But so we're gonna put some links there now, guys, for you guys. One, Alex, the resources for this masterclass with the reference material and the reading. Obviously, we have a lot to read, and yeah, we want to be part of the shift. We want to be part of the people engineering the shift. We need to understand the work that has gone before. Links to feedback on the session, and we need to put some links on that. And just to let you all know about the next sessions, we actually have a bonus session in August. And you all will notice that we have now freed up our masterclasses. Instead of putting a payment barrier on attending live, we're trying to free it up so that we can get more engagement and people can really access the stuff that we're doing. So we have 2 coming up in August, because it's August and it's summer. One is on August 15th. It's a Sunday at 5 p.m. on Ecoside. Jojo Mehta, chairman of the Stop Ecocide Foundation, and Kate McIntosh, head of the Promise Institute for Human Rights, one of the lawyers on the independent legal panel of experts, will be coming back to us, because they did a masterclass for us early in the year. They're coming back to now share with us this legal definition and give us a deep dive into the legal definition that they've come up with for the International Criminal Court, which those of you, and I know Rosalind is here involved in the ecocide movement, but those in the ecocide group, we are trying to build a foundation for people who in their jurisdictions want to promote ecocide nationally at their local levels. We are trying to help them to do that. So if you are interested in promoting ecocide in your local jurisdiction, becoming a part of policy entrepreneurship, and that Sunday is Sunday, 15th of August, 5 p.m. UK time. We will send all of this via email, but I'm just giving you all a heads up because you're here. And the next masterclass is on Sunday, the 21st of August at 2 p.m. on a Saturday, the regular Saturday. And that's going to be exciting. It is on leveraging power from the margins. And it's really about how marginalized groups or people on the sidelines or people who feel that they have no power, how they can use their position to influence change and system change. And it's coming from Chrislyn Moore, who is a former Minister of Justice in Trinidad and Tobago, who is also a former political leader in Trinidad and Tobago, and coming from a very marginalized part of the country, Trinidad and Tobago, she comes from Tobago and she was representing Tobago. So she's coming to bring the insights of how you break into a two-party system. And I think that's going to be incredible, as this was, as I'm really appreciative. I enjoyed this masterclass. So yeah, big thank yous to all of you. Where's the feedback form? Have I put in the link? Let me just put in the link. And yeah, that's it, guys. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Saturday. This is the end of our monthly masterclass. I have 2 feedback forms for you to fill out. One is for us and one is for Alex. Alex wants you to fill out a form so that he can improve his stuff as well. So, and those are the 2 feedback forms. So yeah. Have a great
So much
Saturday.
fun.
Anya, you go. You close us off.
Oh, no. You just did. Come on. Thank you. Thank you for sharing the links and for giving us the homework. We now have to get some feedbacks to hopefully improve our modus operandi. But yeah, thank you so much for leading the masterclass, Alex. I enjoyed it incredibly much. And I enjoyed the company that we had today. So I hope that we'll stay connected and hope to see you next time.
And we'll be sending links out to all of this stuff to you after.
Thank you,
okay, guys.
everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Good
everyone.
to see you, Tessa, Julia, Savia, Rosalind, Joy, Alyssa, Krishna, Shivani. Bye.
Yeah, thanks everyone. That was brilliant. Thank you.